Tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa, aloha kākou. This is the first time that I have spoken at the halau, so I'd like to start by letting you know that sometime in the late 19th century, the Crown took the land that my people had found, which was beautiful land on the side of the Wellington Harbour, because they found that it was quite beautiful land and it would be a really nice place to put really flash, expensive houses on. So they booted us off and we complained, and so they gave us a piece of land in exchange. And the land is a swamp right in the middle of the traditional territories of our some of our long-standing, shall we say, frenemies, arch rivals. And as a consequence, my people have been known as Pipi Wharauroa ever since. The Pipi Wharauroa is a shining cuckoo, and the job of one of the characteristics of a shining cuckoo is that it goes to other people's nests, boots out their eggs, takes over, and then makes themselves at home there. I feel a little bit like a Pipi Wharauroa to be a Māori person from Aotearoa speaking here in a halau. I recognise that it's not my place to speak because I'm not Hawaiian, and yet also recognise the invitation that's been made. So with that sense of humility as a Pipi Wharauroa, I would like to introduce our panel. It's traditional within a Māori context, and we can't help but bring who we are with ourselves wherever we go to acknowledge those who have passed away recently or those we're still grieving for. And given that we're thinking currently about our beautiful region of the Pacific and broadly what's happening in the Indigenous world, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the 9 people who lost their lives in the Solomon Islands as a result of the earthquake and tsunami there just 2 days ago. I'd like to introduce a panel of 3 Indigenous writers. Chantal Spitz, Yorana. Chantal Spitz was the first Tahitian novelist and continues to write fiction, poetry, and other wordish texts, including texts that are used in the context of performance. Mawala Ivau, Albert Wendt, Talofa Lava. Albert Wendt was the first Samoan novelist, also a writer of short fiction, poetry, more novels, theatre texts, as well as a visual artist. Daniel Heath Justice, CEO. Daniel Heath Justice is a fiction writer whose trilogy, The Way of Thorn and Thunder, is the first epic fantasy fiction from an Indigenous worldview. And now we'll start again. I'd like to introduce you to a panel of 3 Indigenous scholars of Indigenous literary criticism. Chantal Spitz. Chantal Spitz, Yorana. Chantal Spitz edits a multilingual journal about writing in French Polynesia and writes essays about cultural production broadly and literature specifically. Mawala Ivau, Albert Wendt, Talofa Lava. Albert Wendt has anthologized, theorized, written essays about and taught Pacific literature as long as he has written it. Daniel Heath Justice, CEO. Daniel Heath Justice writes about, anthologizes, and teaches Indigenous literatures of North America, and his book, Our Fire Survives the Storm, is a critically engaged Cherokee literary history. In this session, we're talking about Indigenous literary studies. And in Indigenous literary studies, you tend to get more bang for your buck. You get both panels. Writers and scholars are often the same people. Through their creative work, as well as their political, institutional, scholarly, and cultural work, each of these panelists has explored the range of ways and reasons for Indigenous engagements with literary arts. In Island of Shattered Dreams, Chantal Spitz's character Te Tiare, in English translation, quote, washes away dirt by writing. In The Adventures of Valor, Albert Wendt's character Alapati is encouraged by other characters for his ability, quote, to story our lives, history, and refusal to become nothing. In The Way of Thorn and Thunder, Daniel Justice's character Toby recalls Strivic's counselling a dragonfly who claims, I don't know how to be a dragonfly, with the suggestion, quote, all you got to do is tell your people's story and you'll figure it out. A lot was said about Facebook yesterday in the session with Koro Albert and Koro Ngugi, and I admit that when I was enthusing about this week's events on Facebook, I ended up writing a post which sounded like an announcement for professional boxers walking into a stadium. Albert towards a new Oceania went, and Ngugi decolonising the mind wa Tiongo. So I suppose to carry on the theme today, we have a panel of 3 boxers entering our stadium. Chantal washes away dirt spits from Polynesia, specifically joining us from Tahiti. Albert, story our lives went from Samoa by way of Ponsonby with a nod to Manoa. And Daniel, tell your people's story justice, who's Cherokee and comes to us from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I want to intrude to add a thought here about why this panel matters, because if we're not clear from the start why this kind of conversation matters, this whole symposium is really just a really nice social event with good food and a lot of collective air miles and exhaust fumes. I don't want to talk about the significance of this panel discussion so we can feel important or self-important, but so we're clear about why we're having it. I also don't want to talk for so long that you're wondering when I'm going to stop talking and let you hear from the people you actually want to hear from. But I do want to add these thoughts just to kick things off. In English, we might call this framing, but in Māori, we use another metaphor. We call this the kaupapa, literally the foundation, which gives us the starting point and grounds the conversation, regardless of where and how the conversation may range over the next hour and a half. The kaupapa isn't the topic. I wouldn't tell any of these 3 what to talk about, but it sets out the purpose. The same metaphor of a foundation can be found around the Pacific, including in Fiji, the place where, as we heard yesterday, Ngugi and Albert had that conversation and shared food together back in the 1980s. In Fiji it said, Yavutini ve talanoa. I was Facebook chatting with my friend Tara in Pacific Studies a couple of days ago about this symposium, Words in the World, and he was joking in the way that a Pacific poet jokes that he would come and that would make him the word made flesh. The word made flesh. The relationships between words and flesh is complicated, and it goes both ways. Words are made flesh, but flesh through representation is made words. And the process of making itself, making words to flesh and making flesh into words, cannot be removed from culture, power or history, as we've heard over and over again in this symposium. My good friend Chad Allen, who's Chickasaw, said to me once that his bottom line for literary criticism was that he never wanted his work to be used in order to remove Indigenous people from their land. I actually started laughing when he told me that, and then I had to stop smiling because I realised he was serious. What? Is that a bit of an overstatement? What possible land-stealing effect could an analysis of an Indigenous novel have? What relationships could words have to flesh? I've been reminded again of this relationship recently, back to Facebook. Something that's been doing the rounds a lot on a number of, I'm sure, our Facebook threads has been the response of some West Papua leaders to Jared Diamond's latest colonialist extravaganza, The World Until Yesterday. What can we learn from traditional societies? As in his other best-selling books, Diamond manages to talk in such broad and badly researched brushstrokes about people, and especially Indigenous people, in order to explain to the beneficiaries of colonialism how it is they came to be superior to everybody else. Apparently, the book spends some time considering the situation in West Papua, claiming that the communities there are deeply and inherently violent, as evidenced by ongoing tribal wars. His specific claims about the situation in West Papua has garnered some response from the people in West Papua. Through a statement circulated by Survival International, Benny Wenda clarifies, Indonesia illegally occupied our country in 1963, and that is when the massacres really started everywhere in West Papua. The Indonesian government did not rescue us from a cycle of violence like Jared Diamond says. They brought violence to us like we'd never known before, etc., etc. Indonesia told the world that this was a tribal war. This book is doing the same. He should apologize. The Indonesian military are committing genocide in West Papua by only talking about tribal war in West Papua and ignoring what the Indonesians are doing to my people. Your book is supporting Indonesia's illegal occupation of West Papua. Another person from West Papua, the Reverend Socrates Yeoman, says, the world before yesterday, this mere book which people are buying now because it's another New York Times bestseller, cannot be separated from the efforts of Indonesia to destroy and wipe out the Papuan people. I hope that the author will openly apologise to we the Papuan people, in particular for the fatal errors in his book. The author is conveying information which destroys our good name. Stealing land, genocide, and destroying a community's good name. Words and flesh, words in the world. This is the real risk of stories and storytelling, but this is also the reason and the urgency. In the New York Times book review of Diamond's book, someone called David Brooks finishes his review by reflecting, has our society become too impersonal? Undoubtedly. Do traditional people serve as models for how we might alter our lives? It's hard to know. They seem so distant. But Koro and Gugi reminded us yesterday that we start where we are. David Brooks is clear about where he is in relation to Indigenous people, so distant. But for us here on the panel, and hopefully in our books, articles, films, theses, dissertations, essays, poetry, fiction, art, and so on, they, or for many of us here today, we are not distant at all, but the place where we begin. Ourselves. Wait, but how can we all be ourselves? How many of us could simultaneously be, for example, Samoan, Maori, and Cherokee? I'm sure that person, if they existed, would be very good looking, but none of us is that person. So how can this panel, stretching across 3 incredibly different Indigenous contexts, be a place to begin? Here, Koro Ngugi helps us think further, or at least tells us about someone who helped him think further. This Māori woman who approached him at the end of his lectures at the University of Auckland back in the 80s, and she said, and I quote him, "You were not talking about Kenya, you were talking about us." Chantal Spitz, Albert Wendt, and Daniel Justice are here because they've all talked about us through their work, which is to say, if I may attempt to extend what my Māori sister was possibly saying back in the 80s in Auckland, they've all made space for us. They've been creating space for the rest of us by writing with such clarity about and from their own specific contexts that their writing is able to speak to us in our specific contexts. Words in the world, indeed. I'm going to ask each of our panellists, and we've decided to go in the order listed in the program. So we're going to hear first from Chantal Spitz, then Daniel Justice, and then Albert Wendt, to share their thoughts about this kaupapa, this yavutu of the panel, to describe for us in whichever way they'd like how Indigenous, Pacific, and world literatures might mutually engage. After we finish, we'll have a time to discuss things. Because we've kind of been moving the time schedule along a little bit, the session will now go until 5:45, I believe. So without further ado, I would like to turn to Whaia Chantal Spitz to